Hello, Internet. My name is Ben Wikler. I am the host of a podcast and radio show called The Good Fight. It's about people changing the world, sponsored by MoveOn.org. And the other day, I had the opportunity to interview Lawrence Lessig about MayDay Super PAC. And at the time, it still seemed like an impossibility that $5 million would be raised by regular citizens contributing in small amounts from across the country. A few weeks have passed, and we are living in a new reality where the old conventional wisdom about whether people care about this issue has been smashed. So I'm delighted to be the moderator tonight for this Q&A with Professor Lessig, with Larry, about what happened and what is next in this movement. Over the last few days, we've had tons of questions submitted online, people voting them by the thousand. During this chat, we also have people pouring in questions at mayday.us/calltime. And so what we'll be doing is alternating between questions that were submitted beforehand and questions that are being submitted live now. If something gets you excited or infuriates you, submit it as a question in real time and people can vote it up. The amazingness of raising $5 million is enough of a sustaining burst of energy that we can kind of turn our eyes up now and look at this challenge of how do we actually use this to get money out of politics. And all the different parts of that giant kind of strategic question are really at the core of the questions that have been flowing in. So I'm going to jump right into it. Thank you, Larry, for doing this. And I will start us off with this question from Guide Guy, whoever Guide Guy might be, who asked the same question that is the #1 question on the live question submission tool right now, which is, how will you establish that a candidate is, quote, committed to fundamental reform? Specifically, what will the candidate have to do ahead of the election to be eligible for MayDay support, and how will the candidate be held accountable post-election?
Yeah, so great. First, Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I feel like we've been in this fight, the good fight, for a long time. We both were inspired to be in this separate fights that we have, but a common end by our friend Aaron. And that podcast you did was an extraordinary tribute to him, and I'm grateful for that. So first question, how will we establish people are committed? So what's important is to understand what they have to be committed to. It's not enough to be committed to the idea of transparency. It's not enough even to be committed to the idea of voting for a constitutional amendment. You've got to take a position on an issue that it's a hard issue to take a position on, and that is to change the way elections are funded. Because if you believe, like I believe, like we believe, that the #1 problem is that we've outsourced the funding of elections to this tiny fraction of the 1%, we need people to stand up for the idea that we have to change the way that funding happens. Now, on the website, we've pointed to this other site, reform.to, that actually points to 5 different proposals, 2 of them Republican, 2 of them Democrat, one that's kind of a mix between the 2, that are proposals that would qualify as this kind of fundamental reform. All of them would create small dollar public funding of elections. So a candidate will only be considered as someone who would be supported if they have supported one of these proposals. And they won't be attacked, they won't be the target if they have supported one of these proposals. So that's the first filter. But obviously in this first round, where we're picking 5 candidates to target in 2014, that's not enough of a filter because there are many people who would satisfy that filter. So the second question is, would winning in their race be both feasible and kind of surprising? Would it demonstrate that this conventional wisdom that says that people don't care about this issue is just wrong? So we're looking at a range of races where there's a really hard contest, where the candidate, if we supported that candidate, would be understood to have won on the basis of this issue. And once they win on the basis of this issue, because of our support, people will say this issue matters to voters, and that will set us up for 2016.
Guide Guy, I hope that makes sense, and you can find, again, the details of those proposals if you go to represent.us. So the second question that was submitted beforehand is from Ryan O'Shea, who got 112 votes for his question. he said the introductory video stated that after the first round of campaign contributions, the idea is to elect a congressional majority to support our goals. I can see where the money comes from in the first round. There's millions we raised through the campaign. But after that, where does it come from? Wealthy donors aren't likely to support MayDay, he says, and we can't expect the grassroots funders to keep contributing. Even if we did, $5 million isn't enough. What's the way forward? How do we affect change when the funding from this first round runs out?
Yeah, so we created a budget for 2014 of $12 million. And that $12 million comes from 2 contingent rounds of funding, the $1 million and then the $5 million, and then 2 matched funding sources of $1 million and $5 million. So that's $12 million. That's our budget for 2014. And in 2014, our objective is to win these 5 races, or to move the dial significantly enough in those 5 races that we can convince people that this issue matters. If we succeed in what we're trying to do in 2014, if we create a kind of Eric Cantor moment about this issue in 2 or 3 of these races around the country, then that sets us up for a very different kind of fight in 2016. And in 2016, what we'll be doing is raising a whole lot more money for a much bigger fight to win a Congress committed to fundamental reform. Not 5 seats, but that might be 20 or 40 seats, depending on where Congress stands around that time. Now, it is a hard question to think about how we're going to raise the money for that round. But a lot of that will depend on how successful we are in this round. So a significant chunk of that, once again, will come from contingent funding, Kickstarted-like funding. But another significant chunk of it is going to come from large donor funding. Now, I think it's right to say some wealthy people would not want to support this change. But I don't think it's right to say that there aren't a significant number of wealthy people who wouldn't support this change. And my bet is we're going to be able to find the resources from both small contributions and large contributions to put together the super PAC that we need to win a Congress committed to fundamental reform in 2016.
Great. So I will just remind folks once more that you can submit and vote on questions at mayday.us/calltime, which is also where people can watch the video of this call if they're using a video-enabled, I guess almost everything's video-enabled these days, type of unit. I will also say that the backdrop, for those curious, behind me here is the March on Washington, which marked another surge of people power that helped to change this country to be more like the country all of us want to live in. Before we go to the live questions, I'm going to ask another question, this one from Matthew, who asked sort of for more detail on this core question. He said, congressional elections in contentious districts can get very expensive, even in a non-presidential election year. What system will be used to pick districts where MayDay will maximize the impact of the money?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you can think about races, like, for example, the race for Mitch McConnell in the Senate, where it's incredibly expensive, and there might be 7 or 8 different issues going on. So if Mitch McConnell wins or Mitch McConnell loses, it'll be hard to say why Mitch McConnell won or Mitch McConnell lost. We're looking for races where if we get into those races and if we have an effect, people will understand the effect will be because of our intervention. And we want to do it you know, in a very cost-effective way. It's not our desire to spend endless dollars on television ads or pour money down large media budgets that will not have an impact. So that's part of the calculus that the team that we put together is working through right now. And I think from seeing the preliminary list, there's a number of races where there's a great opportunity to make an impact in relatively low-cost districts. That if we do have an impact, it'll be clearly understood to be our impact. So the efficiency of the spending in those districts will be particularly high. And there's a great potential to roll into that spending field work or engaging with volunteers. So it's not just about, you know, building ads, it's about beginning to build a much stronger movement that will carry us into 2016 as well. So that's to say, you know, there are a lot of factors, but the objectives, I think, that we have are similar to the objectives of the question, to make sure that we're spending the money in the most efficient way to have an impact, because this is obviously round one. We can't get to what we ultimately want unless we succeed in a powerful way in round one.
So that kind of segues into the next question, this is the #1 question being voted on live right now as we talk. The question is, do you already have candidates in mind who are committed to challenging this broken system?
You know, I have candidates who I would love to be able to support. And we're actually meeting to discuss this. This decision will be made next week when we evaluate whether some of those candidates that I have in mind are candidates that we actually could effectively try to support. You know, again, the question is whether they are the right kind of candidate and it's a viable district. And viability isn't something that you can just magically produce. There's a lot of unmovables in this fight. So yeah, there are great candidates out there who would stand for something that is very valuable to us, both Republicans and Democrats, and I'm going to see how many of those we can get. It makes sense for us to be fighting for.
So the next question on the live voting right now at mayday.us/calltime mirrors one of the top voted free questions, and I'll read the live voted question. The question is, how do we connect locally to make things happen in each state? The pre-submitted question was, will there be materials that we can download wherever we are, whether we're in the targeted districts or not, that could allow us to help move things forward?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes. We're just beginning to develop how that might work. It's going to depend a lot on the campaigns. But what's amazing about the community that we've built is that it can now plug into being a very powerful volunteer force, both locally and not locally. Obviously, a bunch of the work of volunteers doesn't actually have to be in the district. So if we can pick districts that excite people to be part of that community, we want to provide an infrastructure to facilitate that. Absolutely, and it's not. You know, it's important in 2014. It'll be critical in 2016. Because the only way we're going to win this issue in a very big way in 2016 is to produce a kind of army, a kind of effect that hasn't been seen before in politics. And obviously the internet has a potential to be that platform for that kind of effect. But we need to inspire people that there's a reason to try to want to do something about it, and that's the job of 2014, that inspiration.
So we've already seen, you know, this huge outpouring of energy from people who've donated so far. And as you're saying, there will be ways for people who haven't donated and people who have, wherever they live, to get involved in the fight. One of the top questions now is, what are the plans to reach apathetic or even distrustful people, people who aren't already on the team?
So in the long term, that's a critical part of winning. In 2016, that's a critical part of winning. There are a lot of amazing new projects developing to try to figure out how to do that. I've been intrigued by Sean Parker's work with Brigade as an experiment for trying to figure out ways to get different kinds of people inside of political movements. And we've seen a lot of different organizations online find ways to convince people to actually step up and do something who otherwise wouldn't be doing it. And again, I think that we only win in 2016 if we figure out how to deploy that in a very big way. But in 2014, you know, the clock is ticking. We've got, you know, just over 100 days before we're going to be at an election, and 100 days then where we need to be winning elections. And so the capacity of us to build and implement or deploy, you know, significant new techniques or technologies for bringing people out is going to be limited. We'll, you know, obviously use what we can, but the objective in the teams that we're going to hire to execute on these campaigns is to deploy what they know works right now to win these campaigns and to go out and win them. So
let's say we do win. One of the questions is, what would success look like for 2014? And I think you've sort of answered that, which is winning a bunch of races and demonstrating that we can do this, creating some data. One question that a lot of people are asking in both rounds of questions is, how will candidates be held accountable once in office? Someone else, Christina Woodruff, wrote, how are we going to protect the campaign from politicians who just take the money and run?
Yeah, great question. So the thing we're asking them to do right now in 2014 and in 2016 is to commit to co-sponsoring certain kinds of reform. To co-sponsor is a relatively easy thing to do. You write a letter. and the letter gets circulated to the person who has introduced a bill, and it says, please join me as a co-sponsor. We can, within the first 100 days of the next Congress, verify that the people we've elected have in fact done exactly the thing we've said they've done, and we'll celebrate when they've in fact done the thing we've done. And that's what we want to do in 2016 too. We want to elect a majority who have committed to co-sponsoring this reform. Now it's important to co-sponsor because in the way the rules work, if you get a majority of the members who have co-sponsored a particular piece of legislation, you have a tool to leverage that legislation onto the floor. Because obviously leadership in both houses controls what comes up. And you can't just imagine, the support for a bill will actually produce a vote on the bill. So we need to be able to build a political movement strong enough to force this legislation to a vote. Now that's obviously going to hang a lot on who the next president is as well, because we're talking about an election in 2016. There will be a new president. If that president is supportive of this, then we hope he or she presses to make sure that this is one of the first things that Congress passes. But in many ways, I kind of think of this movement as a gift to the next president, whether it's a Democrat like Hillary Clinton or a Republican Rand Paul. Imagine you could walk into a Congress who was, for the first time in 40 years, actually free to worry about what made sense, like what would their voters care about, and not focused obsessively about what their funders will care about. So this is a way to set up the next administration to succeed in a really powerful way, regardless of whether they're Republicans and Democrats, because we've liberated a Congress to be free to lead rather than free to follow the money.
So this raises a question, which is, if we do this, is it enough? And there are a couple of questions that have been upvoted a lot that touch on this. You can answer them, together or separately. One is there a plan to get rid of or at least limit lobbyists, which I think means the power of lobbyists? And the other question is, how do we get a constitutional amendment from here?
Right. Yeah. So first, really important thing. This is not the end of reform. We get this. It's not like we're finished. This is the first step. And there are a whole bunch of other things that are going to happen. And some of them might require constitutional amendments, some of them not. My own view is if we change the way elections are funded, that will immediately change the power of lobbyists inside the system. Because the reason lobbyists are so powerful right now is that they are kind of the in-between, the go-between, between powerful interests and their money and candidates who need their money. And as that powerful go-between, they can extract very powerful returns for the utility they provide these candidates. But once lobbyists are not the go-between, they're not in the center of funding elections, it's not like they disappear. You need lobbyists. Even in utopia, you need lobbyists. But the lobbyists aren't as powerful as they are right now. And so I think a lot of the problem of lobbyists will go away. Now, one of the proposals that we've pointed to, the American Anti-Corruption Act, which you can link to from the reform site, reform.to, that legislation, in addition to creating a kind of voucher to fund elections, that legislation would also create very strict restrictions on lobbyists. Those were written by Jack Abramoff, who they asked Jack Abramoff, put together the restrictions that would have stopped you from doing all the things that you did when you were the lobbyist who was convicted then of felonies for what he did. So he crafted a whole bunch of changes that he thought would fix the lobbying system. And they might be necessary, but I'm not sure they're necessary. But we'll see once we get the change in the way we fund elections. About constitutional change, part of our strategy is constitutional change from Congress requires a 2/3 vote of Congress. There's a separate way of getting an Article 5 convention, which SuperPAC has been pushing, and I support what they've been doing. But from Congress, it's going to take 2/3 of Congress. We don't even have a majority right now for statutory change. Right? We don't have a majority that would support changing the way elections are funded. So our view is, let's take the first step, which is to get a majority in Congress who would change the way elections are funded. Then let's have an election where that majority, the law of that majority is passed, is actually in effect, so that then we have a Congress that is elected according to a system where they're responsive to the people, not to the funders. And at that point, we'd be in a pretty good position to begin to really push for a constitutional amendment from a clean money Congress. If such an amendment is necessary, I mean, you know, the court can fix the mistakes the court made. It's going to be a number of years before we could get to this position. There'll be a number of appointments between now and then. We'll see what will be necessary. But we've got to build a Congress that has the capacity for this kind of reform. We can't just imagine that we can push them, you know, to create 2/3 of the United States Senate to support an amendment today. That just, in my view, just cannot happen.
So it's essentially, if you want a constitutional amendment, if you want to limit the corrupting power of lobbyists, first change the campaign finance system so you can actually do those things.
Absolutely. This is not the end, it's the beginning. It's the first step, but it's an essential step, and that's why we need to take it now.
So going back to how we do this, the number one question voted up right now, and the top question that I haven't asked from the pre-voted questions is, how do we keep this issue nonpartisan?
Yeah, really, really critical. And it's really hard right now because the reality is there are not a lot of Republicans out there who step on the right side of this issue or make this an issue that they care about. There's some. You know, in the House, there's Walter Jones, who's famously supported public funding of elections in a number of cycles. In the Senate, there's a Republican candidate in New Hampshire, Jim Rubens, who is supporting public funding or through vouchers for electing members to Congress. He's running against Scott Brown in the primary. So there are some, but we've got to be able to wage this campaign in a way that convinces people, because it's true, that we're trying to create a Congress that has both Republicans and Democrats who support this reform, because we cannot win if it's just Democrats who support this reform. Not because of the numbers necessarily, but because it cannot be perceived as a partisan reform. That will be enough to completely discredit it. So part of the way to do this is to begin to talk in the language, speak the language of the right about this issue. Like, you know, we have ways that, you know, people on the left like to talk about this issue. But that's a simple translation to the way people on the right like to talk about this issue. So when Dave Bratt beat Eric Cantor, the number 2 issue on his list of issues was crony capitalism. He accused Eric Cantor of becoming a crony capitalist. And crony capitalism is the thing which this corrupt system of funding election produces. That's why there is crony capitalism, because you've got to have some favor to return to the people who are funding your campaigns. When the Cato Institute points out that last year Congress spent $100 billion for corporate welfare, you know, the biggest reason Congress spends that money for corporate welfare while it's cutting unemployment benefits or cutting off people at the bottom is that the people who are getting the corporate welfare are also providing the campaign welfare, the funding that campaigns need. Well, you know, when you begin to focus conservatives on that and you ask them the hard question, when is, you know, I want to ask the Tea Party, when is the Tea Party really going to step up and try to do something about crony capitalism? I think that begins to open up the channels for this conversation that has got to begin to develop on the right as powerfully as it's developed on the left. And I'm hopeful it can happen. It just requires, you know, a commitment that people see as genuine, and that's what I think we're trying to do.
So speaking of big donors, number one live upvoted question right now is, who are the rich folks who doubled our contributions? Are they willing to step out of the shade?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because there's been this weird meme out there that somehow they're hidden in the shade. Everybody knows everybody who matches the donations right now, because the $5 million matching fund has not yet been completed. So as soon as it's completed, those people will be announced. As soon as we have their commitment, they will be announced. The people who matched the original $1 million have already been announced, and they, you know, included Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman, who are Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Included Fred and Joanne Wilson. Fred works at Union Square Ventures, and Brad Burnham from Union Square Ventures. Chris Anderson, who's one of the founders of TED. I mean, who's the curator at TED, at the TED conference, and Vin Ryan, who is who was the founder of Iron Mountain. Those were the original people who matched the $1 million, And when we have the people to match the 5 million lined up finally, we will announce those as well. Everybody in this campaign who gives $200 or more will be identified. We're taking no money from any secret organization. We're taking no secret C4 money. There's no dark money in this campaign at all. And once we're finished, people can look at the distribution of contributions and evaluate whether this is genuinely, primarily driven by small donor contributions or large donor contributions. But those details still are being put together, and as soon as they're finished, they'll be out.
Why is there a reason why not to announce the big matching donors as they come on board? Why wait until you have the whole slate?
I think it's mainly the psychology of getting other matchers. I think people want to be in, they don't want to be seen as slow to the party. So like if we announce the first two, it kind of makes it harder to get the next four. Or we announce the one, it makes it harder to get the other. Look, I want to get this done as quickly as I possibly can. This is supposed to be vacation. You see, I haven't shaved. Unlike you, who looks cool like that by design, I look straggly like this just because I'm supposed to be on vacation. I want to get this done as quickly as anybody, and as soon as we have it put together completely, we will make the announcements.
Is there like a MayDay.us secret page for super rich people that also has a counter that's going up in $100,000 and $1 million increments, and they're checking and looking at a deadline, or like are you just calling people and making the case?
No, there isn't such a page, but of course, if it were a secret page, that's what I'd tell you, right? Yeah, no, unfortunately, I've got to use telephones and things like that to make this pitch, and that's, for me, a hard thing. I very much like email and, other forms of digital communication, but this is the way this pitch has to be made.
It might be worth saying that if a super rich person is watching this, they can email you or tweet at you to tell you that they want to make a big donation.
They can email, absolutely.
Email, okay. So that communication aspect of the campaign goes to the next top voted question, which is, are you going to go on Charlie Rose or The Daily Show or Colbert Report to talk about this?
Yeah, so here's the way it works. You've got to be asked. And I never have said no to those guys. Let's be clear about part of the strategy of why we did $1 million or $5 million. I genuinely thought the only way we could make this work was that if we got, on the central news station of the United States today, which is Comedy Central. So the strategy of raising $1 million and showing that there was this incredible excitement was all about getting enough attention for Comedy Central to pick up, whether it was The Daily Show or Colbert. And it should have been Colbert because, when Colbert floated his super PAC, I met with him for an hour, and I tried to convince him to do what we're doing. I tried to convince him to make his super PAC a super PAC to end all super PACs. And this is an amazing conversation where he said to me, if you have to remember, I'm a character. I've got to keep in character. And the question is, can I make it funny? And I remember thinking, oh my God, for want of a joke, the kingdom was lost, right? There's got to be a way to make it funny. But he was convinced he couldn't make it funny, so he didn't do it. So I thought he would be the logical person to pick this up and to put it on air. And I thought it would be essential that we would be on air for it to get the kind of attention to get us over the ultimate $5 million line. Now, obviously it wasn't, and I was happy for that. But absolutely, I think that we only make this into the super PAC of the size it needs to be in 2016, especially if we get that kind of attention. And I have not yet said no to any of these people who would want to make it some significant part of their story.
So the number one question now is, how are we preparing for a counterattack? And I'll just add, if this actually starts threatening people with power, you have to assume that they're actually going to fight back. They're not just going to sit on their hands.
Yeah. So first, I'm praying for a counterattack, because a counterattack means we're having an effect. I actually don't expect that right this minute, when we start rolling into these 5 districts, there's going to be much of an organized counterattack. The counterattack gets deployed or developed if we're successful in this pilot campaign. So in the next cycle, part of counting how much we're going to need to win the Congress committed to fundamental reform, That will depend on, it will include a part which is about responding to the counterattack. But here's the thing about the counterattack. If you think about an issue like climate change, I'm as committed to climate change legislation as anybody. But there are two sides to that issue. Not the sort of, questioning science side, but, the side that says, well, we have to worry about jobs, or we have to worry about, things right now, when we're in a really bad state. I don't buy that argument. But the point is, you can make that argument and not sound like a crazy person. And so when you have super PACs that spend their money to try to dissuade people from supporting candidates who support climate change legislation, it's not a crazy argument. It can be made. Now, I don't think that's the same thing with our issue. I don't really see the ad that says it's a great thing for the Koch brothers to have unlimited influence in our political system, and we have to protect that power. Or that it's a good thing that the rich have super leverage inside of our politics. I just don't see the argument. I don't see how that gets made. Now, there are lots of ways to obscure the issue and to be making a different kind of argument. I'm not saying it's like slam dunk, but I actually think that if we can genuinely produce a movement quick enough, we can sidestep a lot of that counterattack. And that's part of the reason why I think this has got to be like a lightning bolt. This has got to be something that happens within 2 election cycles. It can't take 4 or 5 election cycles, just because that makes it so much easier for them to win slowly the fight they've got to win to defeat the reform. And I think one great example of that is just look at the way net neutrality has fizzled as legislative policy. In 2008, we had a president elected and many people in Congress elected who said this was their cause. And it fizzles along for 6 years as the lobbyists from the telecommunications, from the cable companies, the most powerful lobbyists in the country, basically set it up so that there's no political will left to do anything to support network neutrality. Well, that's just a tiny part of the fight that will be involved when we actually try to change the way elections are funded. And so I think that that's why we've got to really push as quickly as we can to make sure that this becomes an issue that they vote on within the first 100 days of the Congress in 2017 and get passed.
So if I were, the Koch brothers or some secretive billionaire mastermind counterattacking on this, I would go to one of the first rules of politics, which is if you don't want to argue the message, you kill the messenger. And that goes to one of the top questions right now, which is, despite the 50,000 donations, our movement still feels like Larry Lessig's personal project. How do we change that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How can you possibly try to answer that, Larry Lessig?
Yeah. So I think that this project evolves as this campaign evolves. And I think after this first cycle, after we have some victories in this first cycle, there begin to be a number of real leaders along this issue. And some of them are people that we are supporting. Some of them are people outside of who we're supporting. And I hope a lot of them are people who are not necessarily politicians who want to step up and become part of this movement. One of the most exciting things in this has been to see people who don't want to be politicians, like Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who did a video for us, or even Jason Alexander, who did a video for us, who begin to take prominence on this issue. And we've got to encourage a lot more, because you're right. This will go nowhere as a movement, as the professors' movement. It's got to be a people's movement. And this is, all I want to do is kick it off, get it going. And once it gets going, then we want to encourage as many people to become inside it and become leaders within it. Absolutely.
So for folks that are just joining us halfway through, this is a live Q&A on mayday.us/calltime, the MayDay Super PAC with Larry Lessig, creator of MayDay Super PAC. The top voted question right now is one that we spoke about right at the beginning, but I think I'll ask it again because we are halfway through. Could you detail the criteria used to choose the 5 congressional races for the 2014 test?
Right. So there's a first cut, which is you've got to be on the right side of the issues of the legislation we think of as legislation bringing about fundamental reform in the way campaigns are funded. And you can see that list of legislation at reform.to. But what that means is if you support that legislation, You could be one of the people we support. If you oppose it, you could be one of the people we attack. But if you support it, you will not be one of the people we attack. That's simple enough. But that's obviously not enough. We've also got to find races where candidates are viable. And if we won those races, it would be clear that we won because of this issue. Because the thing we want to do is to produce victories that send a clear message that people care enough about this issue so that they would actually kick people out on the basis of it. Now, there are a lot of ways to look at that, viability and a lot of the cost and the efficiency about how we can run campaigns. And we have a team that's looking through that right now, and next week we'll be in the final stages of making a judgment of which races will satisfy that test. But the objective is to make it so there's some pretty dramatic victories that are attributed to this issue so that going into 2016, we have a much bigger campaign to be waging.
Cool. All right. So the next question harkens back to the previous one in a way, which is about expanding the the faces and the base and the inclusivity of this movement. The question is, how will you win the hearts and minds of people that aren't cis white males, cis traditional gender sex match white males? Most of the famous people who publicly supported you fall into that description, but corruption in politics disproportionately affects women, people of color, and LGBTQ people. How can you broaden your message, find more diverse spokespeople, and broaden the base on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really critical objective. I kind of think it's almost taken care of itself. I think of the most prominent candidate out there fighting our issue is actually in a race that we can't touch because we haven't talked about local or state politics, is Zephyr Teachout, who's running to become a Democratic nominee to challenge, or she's running in the Democratic primary to challenge the governor, Governor Cuomo, and fighting it on this issue precisely, and is one of the best, strongest candidates that I've seen. And if I think of who is the leader, the political leader of this movement right now, she is right at the very top of that list. And I think within the organizations that are concerned about this this issue, many of the leaders are not people who look like me, and that's, I think, really encouraging. Heather McGhee is one of the leaders in the organizations that push this issue. I've taken some of my insight about how to think about this issue from Spencer Overton, who was one of the leaders in the Obama administration, who's written fantastic work about the importance of the participatory interest in politics, where people are giving money as a part of participating in campaigns. That's why I support small dollar funded elections. So I think that people shouldn't look at the surface of what happened to be a campaign that we kicked off and imagine this is a picture of the leaders of this movement. The leaders of this movement are actually quite diverse. I agree with the premise of the question that we can't win unless it is it's seen to be as diverse as I think it already is. And I also agree with the fundamental point of the question, which is this issue, this corruption, disproportionately affects not people who look like me, but people who are people of color or people who are suffering from the oppression that the many facets of this society produce. So I have no qualms about saying this is an issue should be appreciated and fought for across the range of this society. And I actually think that the leadership on this issue is quite diverse. Even if the thing that I kicked off here, harkening back to the point this was just a bunch of support around my particular involvement, seems to be narrow. This is not that's just not a fair characterization of this movement. This movement is very broad, and look to the leaders. The real leaders are people like Zephyr.
So let me ask a little bit more on this question. On the movement and leader part of it, is there a component of MayDay's plan to help lift up a more diverse array of leaders to speak to this and to speak to different communities about this? And on the other side, are you thinking about this in terms of the candidates that you support? Because there is a kind of general public perception that money in politics is a kind of like traditional goo-goo white liberal issue, and the people who are dealing directly with, voter suppression, or like a lot of things that are very like directly affecting people of color in different communities vividly right now, aren't kind of at the same table as the folks that are raising bucks from big donors to to match contributions to MayDay.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to the first part, we certainly are eager to bring in as many different kinds of people to support this as possible. Again, you look at the most important people who stood with us in this last campaign, just from the standpoint of producing the most support out there. Our last day rally was kicked off by George Takei, who's got quite an incredible following of people out there who are motivated by, not just the fact that he's famously from Star Trek, but because he's been engaging in really important issues, especially issues around that affect the LGBT community. And when he stepped up and said this was an important issue for people to consider, and people began to consider it, we got an incredible number of people who jumped in. His approach was inclusive. When Amanda Palmer, who's got a crazy kind of talent and passion and interest in an amazing community who followed her, stepped up and said she wanted to do a show, where she and I did a discussion show, that brought a different kind of community into this conversation as well. So I think we've been eager to see as many of these different communities as we can be brought into it, and as we've been more prominent and successful, I think more people have said they want to join it. Now, then to the question of how this issue affects people, I guess I just don't get how one thinks of this as just a kind of liberal white person's issue, because the people who are most dramatically affected by the issues that get blocked because of the way money corrupts our political system are not the kind of liberal white guys. When we don't solve climate change, the elite in our society will be okay. They'll be fine. They'll find their way to afford the way to cover the cost of whatever. They won't be, forget America for a second. They won't be in Bangladesh where, half the population needs to relocate because of the way in which this problem has manifested itself. When you think about healthcare, the fact that we still have such an incredibly expensive healthcare system, because of the giveaways that had to be given to pharmaceutical companies and to insurance companies, that's not an issue that's a particular concern to liberal white guys. The people who are being denied coverage or being denied the right kind of coverage, especially when you think about the denial across gender gaps, are people who are much more diverse than that particular image presents it. The block in immigration reform is a block that obviously is not, it's not white guys who are trying to immigrate that this problem is affecting, or who are here working incredibly hard but shut out of legitimate employment because of the way the system is currently deployed. I think on every one of the issues that we can say money is blocking reform, you've got to see the people who are harmed by that are not people who look like me. So that's not to say that the diversity is not important, but it is to say that you've got to think one step beyond what is the first obvious point about this issue. It sounds like a boring issue, but people are smart enough. They can understand. They can step back and think, what is every sexy issue that I care about being blocked by right now? What is the cost of the corruption of the system to every important issue that I care about? And I think once you do that, it's pretty easy to see that it's an issue that affects everybody, and like any unequal system, which our system is, it affects the poor or middle class much more dramatically than it affects the elite or the rich.
So we have two questions, one in a sense about the elite and the rich, and another in a sense about the poor and middle class. I'll ask the elite one first. It's a question that's been moving up and down the rankings. Should there be a limit to how much people can contribute to MayDay Super PAC? Like, is it a good thing if one person contributes $50 million?
Yeah, so we want a world where super PACs, as they are right now, are no longer legal. And what that means is not necessarily that you couldn't have independent political action committees, but that the contributions to independent political action committees ought to be limited. Because if they're not limited, they become what they are right now, which is conduits through which super wealthy channel their political influence to try to drive politicians to do one thing or the other. Now, that's where people say, okay, well, you're using a system you think of as unjust to bring about change. And the answer is yes, we are using an unjust system to bring about change, because that's the way it has always been. It has always been the case that people use the existing unjust system to bring about a more just system. So, there was a time when women pushed men to finally organize to extend the vote to women. It was men who voted to extend the vote to women because only men had the right to vote. And that was a terribly unjust system. But if somebody had stepped back and said, geez, do you want to use that unjust system to produce a more just system? My answer would have been, hell yes. Hell yes. We use whatever tools we have to produce a system that we think would be more just. And I think a system where we change the way we fund elections, that's our #1 objective, and establish a rule for political action committees that you can't take unlimited contributions, would be a more just system. And if we have to use large contributions to get there, I think we're going to use large contributions to get there. Now look, we haven't yet faced the problem of a $50 million contribution, or a $1 million contribution, or even a $500,000 contribution. So, we're way from worrying about, whether our soul will be sold. But here's the thing. It's pretty clear to know whether we've sold our soul, because we've been pretty precise about exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for a change in the way we fund elections, and I've just said we're looking to end the system of super PACs. And if you see us talking about, let's lobby for network neutrality or immigration reform, or let's find a way to support the issues that oil companies care about, you'll know our soul has been sold. It's a pretty simple test.
Great. So this is the live question and answer with Professor Lawrence Lessig, the founder of MayDay Super PAC. I'm Ben Wikler, host of The Good Fight, the MoveOn.org powered podcast about people changing the world. We have about 10 minutes left, and we want to get in a bunch of these questions. So I'm going to ask you the questions and ask if you can contain answers to about a minute each, and we'll see how many we can get through. Does that work?
Right. The answer is probably no, but let me try.
Well, that was a great answer. That was much less than a minute, so you've got more time than that for the next 9. The #1 question on the board right now is, how do you feel about Elizabeth Warren's political platform?
So Elizabeth Warren's a friend, and I support a lot that she's doing, and I certainly think it was brilliant for her to pick up student loans as an issue. I wish she'd pick up this issue more dramatically, more aggressively than she has.
Next question, have any candidates yet approached MayDay to request MayDay's support? There's this amazing This American Life episode about money in politics that paints this picture of how it's not just donors trying to get politicians to do what they want, it's politicians begging donors for money and promising to do whatever they want. Has MayDay been the recipient of that reverse magnetism yet?
Yes, many people. Some crazy people, but many really credible people. And I'm actually not responding right now because it's a hard line to, I've got to get trained by lawyers about what I'm in fact allowed to say. So there have been calls made, but I've not yet answered them.
So the next question is about, and we'll have a few of these, it's about the strategy to do this. The question is, how do we frame the legislative solution? Should we talk about clean elections, public financing, legalized bribery, corruption, what?
Yeah, I think what we're looking for when we say we want to change the way elections are funded is something called small dollar public funding. So we want public funding not in the old style where the government decides how much each side gets to spend and writes a large check, but we want bottom-up public funding. the kind of funding that exists in New York City's elections, matching grant funding or vouchers. But that's the form of the solution, because what that does is bring a wide range of people into the problem, into the funding.
I think the question was intended to be, how do you talk about it to make it work? What is the way of framing it, describing it, that actually resonates with people most deeply and most broadly?
So what you're saying is the way I just said it didn't. So maybe I don't have.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, because what I think the way to talk about it is small dollar public funding. It's not. It's that's the thing we're trying to do. We're trying to change the way to fund elections. What do we want to change it to? We want to change it to small dollar public funding.
Every dollar in my wallet is the same size. So I'm gonna say it's a good thing that part of MayDay strategy is hiring the top political communicators, pollsters, and strategists in the nation to figure out how to do this. That goes to the next question. It says the political science evidence says that money alone isn't enough to win elections. And I commend to all viewers the Victory Lab, this amazing book that goes into this, and the Analyst Institute, which does a lot of social science research. How does this affect MayDay.us, which obviously is starting with money?
Right. So it's true that money doesn't affect all the elections, but the problem we're addressing is not whether money affects the elections. It's how money affects the candidates who are trying to raise the money that they believe will affect the elections. So that's the problem to solve, the fundraising problem. Now, we're going to try to deploy money, and there's no guarantee we can deploy money and win. But if you can deploy money around an issue that has been latent and surface it, you can surprise and move the dial in a way that we believe we can around this issue. So that's the objective. It's not the standard spend money against the other side. It's spend money to surface a new issue that people don't think people care about, but it'll turn out they do.
I guess a kind of corollary to the question is there a field strategy under development to use the kind of most proven techniques to win these elections, or is this a large ad buy air war kind of strategy?
There's certainly a field strategy in the districts where that could make sense. That depends on a district, but ultimately the most valuable kind of work is field work, because we're not worried about one election, we're worried about a sequence of elections, and so we're going to be trying to deploy that as much as we can, certainly.
There's another question, which is, in the elections to come, is there a sense of the mix of positive support, positive efforts to support pro-reform candidates versus negative efforts to try to, remove the most anti-reform candidates, or a mix?
Yeah, there's no way to say that in general. There will be a mix. In some districts, it'll look more like attacking somebody. In the other districts, it'll look more like supporting somebody who's a real reformer.
How does MayDay plan to figure out who it's going to partner with and work closely with? There's obviously a lot of groups in this space.
Is the question about to elect people or to?
This is John wrote, how will we decide which related organizations to ally with? Common Cause has worked on this issue for years. I think, is this a vote-alone thing, or how does it fit into the landscape of money and politics groups?
Yeah, so we've been coordinating with everybody who's pushing on this issue that we can. Some people are pushing on the constitutional reform issue, which is not the thing that's at the center of what we're doing. To get to where we are, we had fantastic support from a wide range of groups, including PCCC and Move On and Friends of Democracy, Demand Progress. These were all groups that helped us get the support we need, and we want to work with them going forward to get the candidates elected that we need to get elected.
So Transparency writes a question asker with 44 votes. Is very important to many of us. What steps is MayDay taking to become more transparent? So
the commitment we've made is absolute transparency, except for the people who've given less than $200. And there'll be absolute transparency in how we're spending our money, too. We're just right now in the first filing stages for the expenses and the contributions. The FEC data was closed as of the 30th of June and is due as of the 15th of July. And so we'll be reporting everything we can at that point. But our commitment is to absolute transparency with the one caveat of people under $200. and taking no anonymous or anonymized contributions.
One thing for folks out there to know is transparency takes a lot of work, and I know that the MayDay team right now is crunching all the numbers and figuring out how to present all this data from this, this last round in a way that's comprehensible, and I think we all look forward to seeing what comes out of that. Another question is, why did you make this an all or nothing bet? Why risk calling the entire thing off if you only got 4.9 million instead of 5?
Yeah, the reason was that I didn't want to take people's money unless I thought we could do something with it, and so that argued in favor of a kind of Kickstarter like all or nothing bet, because if we didn't get the scale that we thought we needed to have the effect, then we didn't want to waste people's money. There was a large argument about, well, what if we got close? There was a while where we had a clause on our FAQ that said, kind of a fudge clause. If we got close, we could run for a couple more days. But I actually got that removed, and I said I think we should just bite the bullet and say we've got to meet the deadline, and if we don't, then we don't. But luckily we did with 9 hours to spare.
It was such an amazing thing in the last couple of days. Like 3 days before, MayDay was I think 2.5 or around 2 million, and then there was this flood. Can you give us any picture of what happened, how that incredible energy was unleashed right at the end?
Well, part of it was strategy. So I'm, very proud of the team, which included people from Gear who kind of figured out what to deploy at the right time. Part of it was incredible partners. PCCC and MoveOn stepped in and stepped up at the last couple of days and said they were going to go to their lists and really push this. They had a great resource which was the Good Fight that you had to push out as well, to rally people to that. Part of it was really just great luck. Our volunteers went out to to as many people as they could to recruit people. And again, George Takei was the most astonishing recruit. Who, one of our volunteers knew somebody who was close to the person who does social media and presented the case. And then, amazingly, that morning got this message, we'd like to send this out, and sent this out, and that really kicked it into a whole new community. And this was what we knew from our data. If we could just get enough views on this issue, we would make it. We would get over the line. But the hard thing is just getting people's attention. Like, what do you do to get people's attention? So those things came together on that last day, and once we began to get momentum, it became the issue to talk about. Here in the East, there was a terrible rainstorm, so people were not out on the 4th of July. They were at home. So here's how they could celebrate the 4th of July, Independence Day. They took steps to get us an independent Congress, and that was a really dramatic and exciting last couple hours.
The moment when MayDay PAC crossed the line, it happened to me, it happened to a whole bunch of my friends on Facebook. We were watching the counter with one eye, and fireworks were going off outside of our windows.
Yeah, me too.
Really felt like the 4th.
It was the 4th.
So the last question, there you go. So I'm going to take one more question from our listeners, and then I'll tell folks, if you tweet at Lessig, Larry's a very responsive Twitterer, so if there are questions that can be answered in less than 140 characters, the Q&A can go on. I won't pre-commit you to answering everything. But let's take this last question, and then any final thing that you'd like to say to all the folks who joined in tonight. And I will say thanks to everyone for joining in. This has been a really fun and interesting conversation. The last question, the number one question right now is, why didn't Larry shave?
So the tradition in my family since we've had our first child was that we take a time away with the family. And the one benefit I get is I don't have to shave. So here, this is supposed to be this time away. It's been interrupted again and again. It's interrupted tonight. But I haven't compromised this essential element of the tradition. So yes, I will not shave. I will not be shaving. That's the plan. I hope it doesn't bother people. We should have covered this in the beginning, or I should have done some testing, some data work to figure out whether I needed to shave to have the maximal impact. But no, I'm not compromising that. I'm not shaving. That's it.
We need a political system in which you don't have to shave to be able to help rally millions of people to throw money out of politics. That's what we're fighting for. Well, thank you so much. Is there any closing thing you'd like to say or share with the folks who are on with us at mayday.us/call time tonight?
There is, but it feels cliched because, you know, you're always supposed to thank people, but that's really what I want to do. I really want to thank people, and I want to thank, you know, you, Ben, but I want to thank, you know, this incredible community that built this momentum that made it this impossible thing could happen. You know, I was as surprised as anybody. That morning, I really was convinced we were not going to do it. And I was away on these parades for the New Hampshire Rebellion March, and when I finally sat down with the data people and saw that we were there, I literally was in a Dunkin' Donuts crying. And you know, there's a lot of good reasons to cry in a Dunkin' Donuts, but it was none of those good reasons that I had. I was just in tears, astonished with the way that this has rallied. So I'm grateful to, you know, you did an incredible service to help us spread the message, but to everybody. So thank you. And now we have got the really hard work, which is to pull together the plan to make it so that we can win, so that we can get to 2016 and have an argument for how we're going to change the way politics works in 2016.
Thank you so much, Larry Lessig, MayDay Super PAC, MayDay.us. And as he said, there will be lots of ways for people to help. The fundraising from everybody in this election cycle portion is over, but this will turn into a field campaign, into a people-driven movement in so many ways. So stay tuned to your email list, to the tweets, to the website, and stay involved. I'm Ben Wikler, host of the Good Fight podcast. You can find the episode about MayDay at thegoodfight.fm/25, and you can find all of us and each other on the internet. We have a lot of work to do. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you, Larry.
Bye.